The crisp autumn air carried whispers of change as Grace Miller sipped her coffee alone in the town's only diner. The windows, fogged by the morning chill, let in slivers of golden light that painted the wooden tables and booths in a soft, forgiving glow. Outside, the sidewalks of Stillwater were littered with dry amber leaves, swirling gently with every gust of wind. Grace cupped the warm ceramic mug between her hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers, wishing it could do the same for her heart. She stared out the window, watching the world move without her. It had been months since she'd lost her job at the library, months of unanswered prayers, of sending hopes heavenward and hearing nothing in return. Her faith, once as steady as the old oak trees lining Main Street, had begun to fray like an aging quilt. Yet something inside her, a stubborn, quiet thing, refused to fully give up. Maybe it was foolishness. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a sliver of belief that change somehow was stirring. The scent of pumpkin pie drifted from the kitchen as Pastor John entered the diner. His familiar broad shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. He noticed Grace, immediately offering a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Grace raised her hand in a small wave, and he ambled over, pulling off his hat. "Morning, Grace," he said, voice rich and comforting like a worn hymn. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Of course not, Pastor," she replied, pushing out the chair opposite her. He sat with a sigh that spoke of years and winters past. For a moment, they simply sipped their coffee in companionable silence. Then Pastor John leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Grace lean in. "Sometimes," he said, "answers don't come how we expect them. Sometimes the Lord sends signs in ways so ordinary we almost miss them." Grace smiled weakly. "I'm afraid I wouldn't recognize a sign if it hit me over the head these days." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe you just haven't been looking close enough." Their conversation drifted to the weather, to the upcoming Thanksgiving potluck at the church, to the little things that tethered life in Stillwater. When Pastor John finally excused himself to attend to other errands, Grace lingered, not quite ready to return to the heavy quiet of her own home. The door to the diner creaked open, and a small figure bundled in a thick knitted shawl shuffled inside. An elderly woman with a face lined by 1,000 smiles made her way to the counter. Grace noticed her because of the way the woman moved, not hurried but deliberate, like she carried stories with every step. Grace turned her attention back to her coffee, but when she looked up again, the woman was gone. In her place on the corner of Grace's table was a small, folded piece of paper, heart quickening. Grace looked around, but no one seemed to notice. She hesitated, then picked it up with trembling fingers. Inside, in careful, looping handwriting, were 3 simple words: "Expect the unexpected." The diner seemed to still around her. Grace reread the words as if they might shift under her gaze, reveal some deeper meaning. Expect the unexpected. It wasn't a booming voice from the heavens, it wasn't a burning bush or a parted sea, but it was something. It was enough. She clutched the note, her heart pounding with a hope she hadn't dared feel in months. The next morning, a knock at Grace's door shattered the sleepy quiet of Stillwater. She blinked against the pale morning light streaming through the lace curtains and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Few visitors came calling these days. Cautiously, she peered through the peephole and saw the silhouette of a mail carrier adjusting his cap against the chill. Opening the door, she was greeted by a blast of brisk air and a parcel thrust toward her. "Morning, ma'am," the young man said, stamping his boots on the porch. "Got a package for you. Looks like it might have been dropped off at the wrong address yesterday. Sorry for the mix-up." Grace accepted the box, her fingers numb from the cold. "Thank you," she said softly. The man tipped his cap and retreated down the steps. Grace closed the door, the creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the hush of the morning. She set the package on her kitchen table and fetched a knife to cut the tape. No return address, no familiar handwriting. Curious and admittedly a little apprehensive, she opened it. Inside was an old leather-bound Bible, its spine cracked with use. A flutter of loose pages shifted as she lifted it. Tucked between them was a slip of paper like a bookmark. She unfolded it carefully. "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Isaiah 43:19. The words struck her like a chord vibrating deep within. A shiver not entirely from the cold passed through her. Was this another sign? Or was she simply desperate enough to see meaning in anything? Before she could ponder further, another knock came softer this time. She opened the door to find Henry Walker, her neighbor from 2 houses down, standing awkwardly on the porch. He held a foil-wrapped bundle in one large, calloused hand. "Brought you something?" He mumbled, his voice gravelly with disuse. Grace blinked in surprise. She couldn't remember the last time she and Henry had exchanged more than a polite nod. Rumor had it he was a loner by choice, preferring the company of his old pickup truck to people. "Oh, thank you," she said, stepping aside instinctively. Henry didn't come in. He merely extended the bundle and shrugged. "Made too much. Figured you might want some." She took it, feeling the surprising warmth of it through the foil apple pie she realized, catching a whiff of cinnamon and sugar. Before she could say more, Henry tipped his head in a rough nod and turned back toward the sidewalk, his boots crunching against the frost-bitten leaves. Grace watched him go, the foil-wrapped pie warm against her chest. Inside, she placed the pie on the counter and sat heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the Bible and the note once again. Yesterday, a mysterious message at the diner. Today, a misdelivered Bible and an unexpected kindness from a neighbor she had thought indifferent. Coincidences, maybe. But deep down, where logic held no dominion, she sensed something else. Something moving, a lining whispering through the fabric of her quiet life. She couldn't shake the feeling that her lonely winter was about to be interrupted. By Sunday, the pews of Stillwater's tiny church seemed to hum with unseen anticipation. The stained glass windows glowed with the soft golden light of the late afternoon sun, casting jewel-toned reflections across the polished wooden floor. Outside, the scent of roasting turkeys and spiced cider drifted from the makeshift stalls that lined the church lawn, where the community's annual Thanksgiving charity fair was in full swing. Grace tucked her hands into the pockets of her worn coat as she stepped onto the church grounds, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot accompanying her tentative steps. She hadn't planned to come, had almost talked herself out of it. But something about the hum of expectancy in the air had tugged at her. If there were signs to be seen, perhaps they would be found among familiar faces and warm smiles. Booths decorated with corn husks and pumpkins offered handmade quilts, jars of preserves, knitted scarves, and all manner of home-baked goods. Children ran laughing between tables while adults swapped stories and recipes, their breath puffing in the crisp air. The whole scene glowed with a kind of humble magic, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could knit a community together. Grace wandered past a table laden with pies when she spotted a familiar figure near the fellowship hall entrance. The elderly woman from the diner, her knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, stood speaking with Pastor John. As if sensing Grace's gaze, the woman turned and smiled, her eyes bright beneath the lines of age. Before Grace could retreat, the woman approached, moving with surprising agility through the crowd. "Good afternoon, dear," she said warmly. Her voice, like her presence, felt both gentle and insistent. "It's good to see you here." Grace nodded suddenly, shy. "It's nice to be out." The woman tilted her head, studying Grace with a knowing look. Sometimes stepping out is all it takes to find your next path. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a folded brochure. "There's a charity in town looking for volunteers. They do good work. Could use someone with a kind heart." Grace accepted the brochure, feeling its weight in her hands. The organization's name was unfamiliar, but something about it, something unspoken, called to her. She glanced up to thank the woman, but the lady had already slipped away, lost among the bustling crowd. Pastor John appeared beside her, then his presence steadying. "Funny thing about doors," he mused, glancing at the brochure. "Sometimes they don't swing open with a grand gesture. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone brave enough to knock." Grace clutched the brochure tighter, the paper crinkling under her fingers. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe it was desperate hope. But standing there with the sun dipping low and the voices of her neighbors rising in song, she couldn't deny the flicker in her chest, the feeling that something was shifting. And for the first time in months, Grace found herself daring to believe again. The wind carried the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke as Grace stood before the doors of the charity's small office. She tightened her scarf and shifted from foot to foot, nerves skittering beneath her skin. The building itself was modest, tucked between an antique store and a shuttered bakery. But to Grace, it might as well have been the threshold to a whole new world. She recalled the words of the elderly woman at the fair. Sometimes stepping out is all it takes to find your next path. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the handle. This was it, the moment to either shrink back into fear or lean into faith. Inside the office smelled of old books and fresh coffee. A Christmas wreath adorned the front desk, and fairy lights twinkled around the windows, casting a warm, welcoming glow. Mrs. Carter, a brisk woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, greeted her with a handshake that was firm but not overwhelming. "We're always grateful for extra hands," Mrs. Carter said as she led Grace to a small sitting area. "Especially this time of year needs always bigger than folks realize." Grace nodded, smoothing her skirt. She answered questions about her experience with community work, her time at the library, and her interest in serving. As the interview wore on, Grace found herself relaxing. The atmosphere was unpretentious, genuine, like the best parts of Stillwater. As Mrs. Carter scribbled notes, the front door jingled open and a gust of cold air swept through. Grace glanced up and nearly lost her composure. Henry Walker stood there, awkward as ever, a cardboard box of canned goods balanced in his arms. He gave a small nod to Mrs. Carter, then caught Grace's eye for the briefest moment before looking away. "Well, speak of the angel," Mrs. Carter said with a chuckle. "Henry's been one of our quiet supporters for years." Grace blinked. Quiet was certainly the right word. She watched as Henry placed the box on a nearby table, dusted his hands on his jeans, and turned to leave. Without a word, something about the way he moved, the gentleness hidden beneath the rough exterior, made her chest ache. Mrs. Carter flipped through a folder, pulling out a paper Grace hadn't noticed before. "You know," she said conversationally, "it was Henry who mentioned you to us a few months back. Said you were the kind of soul we needed more of around here." Grace's breath caught. "He did," she whispered, unable to mask the disbelief in her voice. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. "Yes, ma'am. Said you had a good heart, and that's worth more than any resume." Grace pressed her fingers to her lips, overwhelmed. All this time she had thought she was forgotten, invisible, slipping away unnoticed. Yet someone had seen her. Someone had cared enough to open a door she hadn't even known existed. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she realized she had never truly been forgotten. Grace's new days began not with despair, but with the golden hum of purpose. Each morning she rose before the sun, bundling herself against the crisp air and making her way to the small charity office. Her heart, once heavy and reluctant, now beat with quiet anticipation for what the day might bring. Stillwater's needs were simple, but profound: meals for the elderly, warm coats for children, companionship for the lonely. Grace found herself delivering baskets of food, helping organize winter coat drives, and sitting with widows who needed nothing more than a listening ear. In the giving, she discovered a richness she hadn't known she'd lost. The town, too, seemed to transform with the season. Houses along Main Street donned strings of colored lights. Storefronts boasted paper snowflakes and pine garlands. Even the diner had a new wreath hanging crookedly above its door. The annual Lights of Stillwater contest brought out a quiet but spirited competition among neighbors. Each night, Grace would walk home beneath a sky of twinkling lights, feeling less alone with every step. At the charity office, she often crossed paths with Henry. He would appear without fanfare, arms laden with donations, canned goods, knitted hats, even handmade wooden toys. Their conversations remained sparse. Nods, the occasional morning. And once, a gruff, "Stay warm." But something unspoken stretched between them, a thread of mutual understanding that needed no words. As Christmas approached, Mrs. Carter decided to host a small appreciation gathering for volunteers. The fellowship hall at the church buzzed with activity as townsfolk gathered with homemade pies, crock pots of chili, and pots of steaming cider. The atmosphere glowed with simple gratitude. Grace hovered near the refreshment table holding a paper cup of cider when she spotted Henry standing awkwardly near the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. The room, alive with chatter and laughter, seemed to swirl around him, leaving him untouched. Without thinking, Grace crossed the room. She cleared her throat softly. "Henry." He looked up startled, then shifted his weight as if preparing to leave. Grace hesitated, then found her voice. I wanted to thank you. Henry blinked, the slightest crease appearing between his brows. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. She continued, her words steady. For seeing something good when I couldn't. The room seemed to hush around them, or maybe it was just her heart beating loud in her ears. Henry opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face, so often closed off and unreadable, softened. And for once Henry didn't look away. He simply smiled, a smile full of secrets only heaven knew. Snow dusted Stillwater's rooftops as Grace stepped onto her porch, a letter clutched in her hand. The world around her was wrapped in a hush, the kind of silence that only came with fresh snow, a sacred stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath in reverence for the season. She drew her coat tighter and stared at the envelope, her name written in a familiar, careful scrawl. It had been tucked into her mailbox sometime after sunset, the ink slightly smudged from the cold. Heart thudding softly, Grace opened it and unfolded the single sheet inside. Grace, I'm not much for talking. Never have been. But you ought to know, you being here, doing what you're doing, it's made a difference. Not just for the town, for folks like me too. People forget sometimes, but kindness leaves a mark. You left one. Thank you, Henry. Grace blinked back, sudden tears, the paper trembling in her gloved hands. She tucked the letter carefully into her coat pocket and turned her steps toward the church, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Stillwater's tiny church glowed against the darkening sky, its stained glass windows lit from within, casting rainbow reflections onto the white-blanketed lawn. Inside, the pews were packed with familiar faces, bundled in scarves and coats, their cheeks rosy from the cold. Children squirmed in excitement, and the scent of pine and candle wax filled the warm air. Pastor John stood at the pulpit, his Bible resting open before him. His voice carried through the sanctuary, steady and sure. Blessings, he said, often come wrapped in trials. They don't always look like miracles at first. Sometimes they come in the form of hardship, of loneliness, of doors closed tight. But if you look closely, if you stay faithful, you'll see every tear, every stumble, every unanswered prayer is just another thread in the tapestry. He's weaving for your good. Grace sat quietly among her neighbors, the letter pressed against her heart, feeling every word sink deep into her bones. She bowed her head as the congregation sang their voices, rising like smoke into the rafters, carrying prayers and hopes and silent thank yous. Heavenward. When the service ended, she lingered outside, standing beneath the twinkling lights strung from lampposts and storefronts, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked around the simple beauty of the town. The laughter of friends reunited, the quiet kindness of strangers who had become family, and felt a warmth kindling inside her stronger than any fire. Beneath the twinkling lights, Grace knew she had seen the signs and followed them home. As the last carol faded into the snowy night, Grace stood still for a moment longer, her heart full and light. She had weathered the storm of loneliness, only to find that blessings had been stitched quietly into every hardship. True kindness, she realized, was often hidden behind the simplest gestures. The warm pie, the unexpected note, the silent support. Like tiny lights against a vast winter sky, even the smallest acts of faith illuminated the way home. Sometimes when you dare to believe beyond what you see, you find that goodness had been walking beside you all along. Type amen in the comments if you received this message, and don't forget to subscribe to God Message Today for more faith-filled content that strengthens your walk with God. See you in the next video.